And the presence now of the Revolutionary Guards, who happen to be the most powerful elite group in Iran, and some would say even more powerful than the supreme leader himself, more powerful than the parliament and the president, the judiciary, and all the other institutions of the state, has basically morphed to the position that they are in now. And so briefly, what I would outline are two reasons why Iran is in this kind of critical stage, that the Revolutionary Guards have somewhat supplanted the regime, have really co-opted all other organs of the state. And I would say that the first reason is an internal one, and the second one is an external one. And that internal problem, this existential crisis that the regime was facing, has a lot to do with a reform movement, not the Mossavi reform movement that we're talking about in 2009, but the reform movement that began in the country in 1997 with the election of Mohammad Khatami, who was elected in 1997 as a reformist leader, where the majority of people voted for him. He mobilized the youth, mobilized the female population, and really gave Iranian society hope that there would be change. If there would be change in Iran post-1997, as Khatami was talking about, the Revolutionary Guards would clearly be threatened by that. Is when the Revolutionary Guards were first basically assembled at the time of the 1979 revolution, they were under the supreme leader himself, who is above the law and above the state. It has the Iranian system has a dual structure where there's the clerical supreme leader that oversees multiple institutions, and then the elected president who has a cabinet and also the parliament, which also has elected seats. The supreme leader had the Revolutionary Guards as guardians of the ideology, the Islamicness of the revolution, and were initially meant to counter the leftists, the Marxists, who wanted to basically shape the Iranian state post-1979. And so that was their goal, their function. They dealt with Friday prayers. They were not independent of the supreme leader. They were not involved really in foreign policy. They did not have a steady income on their own. As the revolution was solidified and the state was formed in the early 1980s, the Revolutionary Guards served as an additional military, if I may, during this very long Iran-Iraq war that lasted for about 8 years. So in addition to the 450,000 men in the Iranian military, you have these now 150,000 strong Revolutionary Guards who channeled their energies towards combating Iraq in this long war. When that war ended and there was business as usual in Iran, they really needed to reconfigure and reinvent themselves. And that internal crisis that is linked to the reform movement was that window of opportunity for the Revolutionary Guards. So when Khatami comes to power in 1997, and he's calling for reform, and people are talking about how women in Iran, their veils are slipping back, that there's more arguing on TV, that there's criticism of the regime, that there may be some sort of change in Iran, the Revolutionary Guards immediately regrouped. And they wanted to make sure that all the reforms that the former president, Khatami, put in power were blocked. So the Revolutionary Guards worked to make sure that all the parliamentary seats that were held by reformists, supporters of Khatami in 1997, were now taken over by conservatives. And so they infiltrated all of the different institutions of the state. So by the time Khatami is ending his first term and up for re-election, he was pretty much depressed and thinking there's no hope. The conservatives are basically taking over the system. The Revolutionary Guards are basically running the show. We're not sure if they're against the supreme leader. We're not sure which faction they belong to now. But we do know that in order for them to survive, to reinvent themselves from the initial stage of 1979 guarding the revolution against the leftists, then channeling their energies towards the Iran-Iraq war, and now combating this internal reform movement that can destabilize them as an institution themselves. They worked to make sure that there was no major structural change in Iran through this reform move, through thwarting this reform movement. And so June 2009, when Mousavi is up for elections, and Khatami, incidentally, first announced he would run for president, but decided to let Mousavi run, isn't this reform movement out of the blue. It's a continuation, or picking up where Khatami's reform movement left off. They were pretty much crushed. All of the legislation that they tried to pass to loosen the strangle by the regime was basically left as it was, and all the student protests were spontaneous and not organized. And Khatami kind of disappeared from the political scene in Iran after Ahmadinejad came to power. What's different in 2009, and why it matters, is essentially that the reformists, for the first time, are showing organized civil liberties movement, right? They're not looking necessarily for this full-fledged revolution to overturn the system, but it's a practice in society contesting the wrongs that they see that basically done by the state. And no other point in 1979, since 1979, do we see an organized reformist movement contesting violation of rule of law. And so the June 2009 election, for many of us who are hopeful about this democratic deficit or this democratic puzzle that we can't solve in the region, think that internal change will basically spark external or regime change as opposed to external powers coming in, right? The example of the 2003 war in Iraq is not the way Iranians want change to happen, that they would prefer indigenous channels in order to fix what they saw as a violation of their civil liberties. And so the Revolutionary Guard, to basically stay in power, have found all these different methods and reconfigure and reinvent themselves in order to prevent the reformist movement from picking up. Even though the reformers now say that they're strong, that they may not demonstrate in the streets every day because the regime has cracked down on them, but they think that they have a potential in the future to keep the movement going, and they make these periodic statements. You can go to their website, Green Voice, and see what their platform and agenda is for the Now, the second issue, which I probably don't have much time to talk about, but I'll briefly outline, is this external legitimacy crisis that Iran is dealing with today because of relationships with the United States, because its antagonism towards Israel, because of its potential to destabilize the Persian Gulf. And the legitimacy crisis, also related to the Revolutionary Guards and kind of their rise to power, has a lot to do also with this reform movement.